Step 24 is developing a fragnet, and a fragnet is simply stands for a fragmented network. So we're going to go ahead and enter another work breakdown structure that will change the schedule in some way. It'll add it, it'll delete it, it'll modify it. Somehow, some way, a fragnet will do one of those things. The first thing we want to do is we want to save, right? We want to export and we want to save it as a fragnet. So we're going to make sure we save the name, and then we go, fragnet, right? And we save the name, not a schedule update, a fragnet of this, right? And we want to maybe name the fragnet, fragnet 001 or something like that. And then we go ahead and save it. I'm not going to go through that because I'm not going to hit finish because no need to waste that time. So first thing we want to do is we want to take the last schedule update before the delay occurred. Now, if we wait 6 months to do a fragnet, it kind of defeats the entire purpose, and it's tough to determine. We have to do something called normalizing the schedule. So we need to react quickly. We need to take the last schedule update, and then we need to start developing a fragnet. The first thing you do before you do anything else is you want to notate. Now, this is the last schedule update that we did from previous videos. We want to look down at the contract completion date, okay? The CCD. Now we have a -27. So we're going to go ahead and note that somewhere so we know when we do the fragnet that, say this -27, we own it, right? Because we have a delay in the project. This is not something we're going to go and do, that we're going to have to that we may get an additional change order from the government or the client. So we know that we own that 27 days. So we're going to notate that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a work breakdown structure for the fragnet itself. So we're going to go to work breakdown structure, and we're going to create a fragnet somewhere within the WBS. I like to do it like at the top, and then I'm just going to name it, fragnet, okay, and then that's a done deal. So you'll see now that the fragnet is inserted right there. And then we're going to add activities to that fragnet. So we'll put in, say this is an RFI 001, and it has to do with some type of delay that occurred, okay? Some type of delay, or excuse me, it could be a delay, it can be a change. We're going to go ahead and say we're going to add some scope, okay, for this example. And then we're going to RFI 001, we're going to do design, and then we're going to go ahead and do RFI 001, we're going to do procure, and then, I made a mistake there. And then, we go into the actual construction, RFI 001, and we go the construction, okay? So we now have all the activities that go into adding additional scope, okay? We can say, okay, so now we're going to say we'll go to the durations and we'll give it durations. So we'll add the scope. We'll give 2 days for that. We'll give for design, we'll give 10 days for that. We'll give 20 days for the procurement, and for the actual construction we'll go 15 days, okay? So now that we have all these activities in, the very first after we add in the characteristics, one thing we didn't do is we didn't add in the calendars, okay? We want to go ahead and add in the individual calendars. We can go right here to it's a WBS activity calendar, and we want to assign the calendar to the project. We maybe make that a 7-day and make that a 5-day with holidays, but you get the point, right? So we got to add the names, the durations, the man days if applicable, and then we want to add the calendars. So now that we have that in, we're going to go ahead and say, all right, well, the first activity doesn't have a predecessor for Fragnet. It happens on a specific day, because you got to remember this is actually real time. It's happening real time. So let's say that it actually occurred. It started on October 11th, and then now that we know it started on October 11th, now we're going to tie predecessor logics into here, because the first activity is fixed to a start on date. The next activities are fixed to the logic. Okay, so we know that a change occurred. We know we added scope at a certain point. So the next thing is we're going to add predecessor logic in. We're going to say, okay, the predecessor to design is going to be to add the scope. Okay, now we can go to the next one, and then procure is the design, and construction is the procure. Okay, so now we have a little network tied in here. You can see with logic, we have a specific starting point that's attached to an actual date. Okay, and we can put a constraint on it. What I like to do is just go ahead and fix it, put a start on date. Okay, and now that we have that, the toughest thing about this is figuring out where it's going to tie into the existing schedule. So we can say, okay, the construction, because we added this specific scope of work, it's affecting the 100% plans. So we're going to say, okay, the construction of this will affect the final design. Maybe there's some measurements, or maybe there's some uncertainty in that. We can assign it there. We can go down and look, okay, well, what about the anchor bolts? Let's see. We're looking at only critical path. Easiest way I find it is just sorting by critical path, filter by critical path, and now we can kind of see what the critical path tasks are. The problem is that we don't have our Fragnet being shown here because it's not tied into the logic yet. But we can look at the critical path and say, okay, is it or is it not going to tie into one of these critical path tasks? If it's not, then we're not entitled to any additional time. So that -27 of negative float on the CCD doesn't change the ultimate duration. So we wouldn't be entitled to additional time. However, if it increases that -27 because it's tied into the critical path and it becomes part of the critical path, then we could be allotted more time. So let's say that 100% plan review is a good example. Okay, say that there's something related to the 100% plan review that we cannot get done until RFI 001 construction's occurring. Okay, so we tie that into a predecessor. Now what we do is we'll filter it again. We'll apply it and then put the filter back on. And now we see that the Fragnet is part of the critical path. And we go down to the bottom and we look at, okay, what is the CCD? And if you remember when we talked before, we had a -27 days, meaning that's what we were entitled to. Okay, we were entitled to 27 days of of time. So now we got to figure out, okay, now it's saying that we have -69 days. So simply we take 69 minus 27, because the 27 is the time that we own of a delay, and we have 42 days. So the client, the government, or whoever the individual would be, now owes us 42 days because we own the 27 days of negative float because it was our responsibility, and the actual 42 days were a result of the added scope in RFI 001. So that's what a Fragnet does. Okay, now if it didn't, once again, if this didn't tie into the critical path, then we wouldn't be entitled to any additional time. So we're going to put the natural successor, and then at the end, this is something a lot of people don't do, is they do a Fragnet schedule, but then they don't do a narrative associated with it. You have to explain the logic involved there. You have to explain on this specific date, October, whatever the date is, it's October 11th is when they added the scope. And after they added scope, we had to go through design, procurement, and construction, those sequences, and we explained the durations associated with it. And then we got down to the Fragnet where it ties into the rest of the schedule. We go to relationships and we explain why does R5001 construction have to have a successor of 100% plan review. So we have to explain that. Most people go through the process of doing all this work, putting the Fragnet in, but then they don't explain it. That's why it's important to have a narrative to explain exactly what occurred. Now, if you have a concurrent delay, that means the delay. Say we had, we still had 27 days, but the critical path for the Fragnet was still. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we'll remove this. Okay. Now, say there's a delay, and maybe this was also critical. Concurrent delays means that the owner has a delay and we have a delay, and they occur over the same period of time. That's a concurrent delay. Now, we were based on the schedule update, we got 69 days, right? But we also had a concurrent delay of 27, means that we had 27 days, they had 27 days. That was delay. Our 27 days is because we're behind on productivity. Their 27 days is based on the added scope. Well, that becomes a wash, okay? At the end of the day, we got to kind of throw that out. That's why we subtracted 69, which is the total negative float from 27 days, and that means that we're only entitled to 42. That's called a concurrent delay. You're not entitled to additional time if there's a concurrent delay, and it's just kind of being fair. I have a delay, you have a delay. Well, if we both have a delay, nobody's given anything. Okay, so that's a key point. So kind of going through, a Fragnet is a fragmented network. It's done to change a schedule by adding, deleting, or modifying a specific scope of work. We always want to save the schedule as a Fragnet before we begin. We're going to take the last update, the latest schedule update, and we want to use that. Now, we don't want to try to do a Fragnet for something with an update 4 months ago. We need to take care of the Fragnet immediately when it occurs. And we may not know all the individual items, but we got to guesstimate it, and that comes into negotiating the change. So it's not necessarily 100% clear. So we take the latest schedule update and we use that as our Fragnet schedule. We note the negative float on our contract completion date, or the very last activity, which is usually the contract completion date. We create a work breakdown structure for the Fragnet. We add activities into that Fragnet when we put durations, logics, and we assign calendars. On the very first activity, we put a start date, an actual start date, because we know that, and then we tie all the logic, all the predecessor and successor logic, until the very, very last activity in the Fragnet, and that successor will be tied into the existing schedule logic. Once that occurs, we review the negative float on the last activity, which is typically the contract completion date, and then we subtract that negative float from the negative float that we had on the schedule update. In our case, we had 69 days. We subtracted the 27 days that was part of the last schedule update. Now remember that if that last schedule update and you got that 27 days and you expect to get compensated for that 27 days, you're not going to subtract it. Okay. Well, if you know you're going to get it back from the government or the client, that 27 days, and you should subtract it. But the entire point related to that is that you don't want to ask for it twice. Okay. But in this case, in this scenario, we said that we own that 27 days of negative float. We sorted by critical path, filtered by critical path. We looked at the contract completion date. We added a narrative to explain exactly what occurred, and that's how to do a Fragnet.